In the wet, heavy spring of 1974, 27-year-old Linnea Greer stood at the edge of her dead father's rice paddies and listened to the silence of water that had forgotten how to grow anything worth harvesting. She had inherited 640 acres of Arkansas bottomland, a farmhouse with a kitchen faucet that ran brown every morning until you let it cash, a rusted International Harvester combine that needed 3 tries to turn over on a good day, and a reputation she hadn't earned yet but was about to. She had also inherited his notebooks, not the clean, ruled ledgers you'd buy at an office supply store, but a collection of composition books, the kind school children used, their covers warped and stained, their pages filled with her father's small, careful handwriting. Boyd Greer had been a rice farmer for 31 years, and in that time he had written down everything he saw. Not everything he thought, everything he saw. There is a difference, and it matters. The rice farms of Prairie County in those years were locked in a quiet war, not against weather or market prices, though those were enemies enough, but against the land itself. The Paddies, flooded season after season, had become breeding grounds for a particular species of aggressive watergrass that choked the young rice shoots before they could establish themselves. The solution, endorsed by the university, by the county, by every agricultural pamphlet pinned to the corkboard at the co-op, was a chemical herbicide called STAM, a propanil-based spray applied by tractor-mounted booms in the early weeks after planting. It worked. Nobody disputed that. It killed the watergrass dead. It also killed the tiny organisms that lived in the paddy water, the larvae and the snails, and the microscopic creatures that had once been part of a living system. Over the years, the paddy soil had become something close to sterile mud, capable of growing rice only with increasing applications of synthetic nitrogen. And, of course, more STAM, because without the natural competition, new resistant strains of water dations, requiring stronger formulations, higher doses, and deeper debt. Boyd Greer had watched this cycle from the inside. He had sprayed like everyone else, borrowed like everyone else, and worried like everyone else. But unlike most of his neighbors, he had also watched the drainage ditches at the far edges of his property where the runoff collected in still, forgotten pools. And there, in those neglected puddles, he had seen something that nagged at him for the last decade of his life. Wild ducks. Not many. A handful of mallards and a few teals that stopped during migration and sometimes lingered. They would paddle through the shallow water, dipping their heads, stirring the mud, eating whatever they could find. And Boyd noticed, year after year, that the weeds in those drainage pools were sparse compared to the weeds in his treated paddies. The water was clearer. The mud at the bottom was darker, richer, different. He wrote it all down. He sketched the pools with little arrows, showing how the ducks moved through them. He noted dates, temperatures, rainfall. On a page dated November 1969, underlined twice, he had written a single sentence that his daughter would read 4 years later with trembling hands. What if the ducks are the spray? Boyd never acted on it. He was 56 years old, deep in a cycle of seasonal loans, and too tired to fight the current. He did what he always did. He sprayed, he harvested, he paid what he could, he borrowed the rest. He died of a heart attack in January of 1974 at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee still warm beside his hand and a composition book open to a page about soil pH. Linnea found him there when she came in from checking the levees. She was 27, unmarried, with a degree in biology from the University of Arkansas that she had never used because her father needed her on the farm. She was not a small woman, nor a loud one. She had her father's watchful eyes and her mother's stubbornness, though her mother had been gone since Linnea was 14, taken by a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. Linnea had learned to drive a tractor at 12, to weld a broken implement at 15, and to keep the books at 17. She knew the farm the way you know a body you've lived inside your whole life, not from study, but from feel. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, and the neighbors stopped checking in, she sat in the kitchen with the stack of composition books and read them cover to cover. It took her 4 days. When she finished, she read them again. And then she did something that made her the most talked about person in Prairie County for the next 5 years. She drove to a poultry operation outside Stuttgart. A man named Jessup who raised Muscovy ducks for the restaurant trade in Little Rock. She bought 200 juvenile ducks, females mostly, along with a dozen drakes. Jessup loaded them into crates on the back of her truck and looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to ask a question, but wasn't sure it was his place. She paid him in cash, money from her father's life insurance, the same money the bank was expecting her to put toward the spring planting loan. She drove back to the farm with 200 ducks quacking and flapping in the truck bed, pulled up to the East Paddies, the ones she had already flooded for the season, and opened the crates. The ducks tumbled out, awkward and panicked, and then they hit the water. The transformation was immediate. They spread across the shallow paddy like a living wave, dipping and diving, their flat bills working the surface and the mud beneath it. Within minutes, they had settled into the ancient rhythm of their kind, foraging with an efficiency that no machine could match. Mr. Rawlins saw it first. He farmed the adjacent section, a big man with a sun-ruined face and hands like leather gloves. He was on his four-wheeler, checking his own levees, when he spotted the commotion. He drove to the fence line and sat there for a long time, watching 200 ducks paddle through Linnea's rice paddy like it was a municipal park. Then he killed the engine and walked to where she stood on the levee. "Linnea," he said, and the way he said her name carried a whole paragraph of meaning. Concern, confusion, a gentle prelude to the suggestion that maybe she needed to talk to someone. "Mr. Rawlins," she said, "those are ducks." "They are, in your rice paddy." "Yes, sir." He took off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck, the universal gesture of a man confronting something outside his experience. "Linnea, honey, I knew your daddy a long time. He was a good man and a careful farmer. But ducks in a rice paddy, they'll eat the seed. They'll trample the shoots. You'll have nothing come August. They won't eat the rice." She said, "Muscovies don't prefer grain when there's protein available. They'll go for the watergrass seedlings, the snails, the insects. That's what they're designed to do." He stared at her. Then he looked at the ducks. Then he put his cap back on. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, though his voice made clear he believed she didn't. He climbed back on his four-wheeler and drove away, and by evening Linnea knew the story would be in every kitchen in the county. She was right. By the end of the week, she was a punchline, the duck lady. Boyd Greer's girl had finally cracked under the strain. Grief and a college education. Someone said at the diner, a dangerous combination. The laughter was not entirely cruel. These were people who had known her since birth, and most of them genuinely believed she was making a terrible mistake. They laughed the way you laugh at a child who insists on wearing rain boots on a sunny day. They thought she would learn. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room and known with absolute certainty that you were right about something, and known with equal certainty that not a single person around you believed it? It is not a feeling of superiority. It is a feeling of profound isolation. You begin to question not the idea, but yourself. Maybe you're not seeing what you think you're seeing. Maybe grief has distorted your judgment. Maybe the world is right, and you are simply, stubbornly, dangerously wrong. That was where Linnea Greer stood in the spring of 1974, with 200 ducks in her paddies and not a friend in the county who thought she'd have a harvest come fall. The official visit came 6 weeks later. Mr. Dorsey, the county agricultural extension agent, was a trim man with steel-rimmed glasses and a voice that never quite rose above the level of a disappointed schoolteacher. He arrived in a white government truck with the state seal on the door, clipboard in hand, his shoes clean in a way that told you he did not often walk in mud. He had heard the reports, he said. He was here in an advisory capacity. They walked the levee together. The paddies were green now, the rice shoots coming up in neat rows, and between them the ducks moved in lazy, purposeful patterns, their heads dipping and rising, like oil derricks in a flooded field. "Miss Greer," Mr. Dorsey said, consulting his clipboard as if it contained answers she lacked. "I've reviewed your father's planting records. This acreage historically requires 2 applications of propanil at minimum, followed by a nitrogen top dress in June. I see no evidence that either has been applied this season." "That's correct. Then how do you intend to manage the watergrass?" She pointed at the ducks. Mr. Dorsey's lips pressed together. He made a note. "Miss Greer, I understand the appeal of a biological approach. It's romantic, but we have 40 years of data showing that chemical weed control is the only reliable method for commercial rice production in this region. These ducks cannot possibly cover 600 acres. The math simply doesn't work. They don't need to cover all of it at once," Linnea said. "I rotate them. 3 days in one paddy, then I move them to the next. By the time they cycle back, the watergrass has germinated again, but the ducks eat it at the seedling stage before it competes with the rice. Meanwhile, their droppings are feeding the paddy. I haven't applied a single pound of nitrogen because they're doing it for me." Mr. Dorsey looked at her the way you look at a patient, well-meaning person who is explaining why the earth is flat. "The nitrogen output of 200 ducks," he said slowly, "is a fraction of what this soil requires. You will see chlorosis in your rice by July. Yellowing, stunted growth, and by then it will be too late to correct. My father's notebooks suggest otherwise. Your father, with respect, was not a scientist." "No," Linnea agreed. "He was a man who watched things more carefully than most scientists do." Mr. Dorsey capped his pen with a decisive click. "I'll be filing a report. I strongly recommend you reconsider before irreversible damage is done to this season's crop. We can still arrange an emergency herbicide application. The window is narrowing, but it's not closed." "Thank you, Mr. Dorsey." He left. She learned later that he cited her farm as an example of non-evidence-based practices. In a presentation at the State Agricultural Conference that summer, he used a slide with a photograph of ducks in a paddy. The audience laughed. Someone in the back row made a quacking sound. The next visitor was smoother. Mr. Pickett represented a regional chemical distributor that supplied most of the rice operations in the county. He was younger than Henderson, mid-30s, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He wore khakis and a polo shirt with the company logo over the heart, and he brought a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper as a gesture of friendliness, setting it on the tailgate of her truck like a peace offering. "Miss Greer," he said, cracking one open and offering it to her, "I'm not here to tell you what to do. Lord knows you've had enough of that." She took the Dr. Pepper. It was cold. She drank it and waited. "Look," he said, leaning against the truck, "I respect what you're trying. Honestly, I do. Your daddy was old school, and there's honor in that. But here's the reality." He lowered his voice as if sharing a confidence. "Your neighbors are watching. The bank is watching. If your yields drop this year, and they will, you won't just lose a season. You'll lose the farm. I've seen it happen a dozen times. A bad year turns into a foreclosure, and some outfit from Memphis buys the land for pennies. He paused, letting the fear settle. I'm authorized to extend you a full season's chemical package on deferred payment. Herbicide, nitrogen, the works. No money down until after you sell your harvest. That's not a sales pitch, Linnea. That's a lifeline. Linnea looked out over her paddies. The ducks were moving through the late afternoon light, their wake catching the sun, small ripples spreading behind each one, like the lines of a story being written on water. "Mr. Pickett," she said. "My father kept notebooks for 30 years. In one of them, he wrote down the cost of every chemical application he ever made. Every bag of nitrogen, every drum of stam. I added it up after he died. Do you know what the total was?" Pickett shook his head. More than the land itself was worth. He spent more poisoning this soil than the soil was worth on the open market. And at the end of it, the soil was worse than when he started. The weeds were stronger, the water was dead, and he was in debt up to his collar. That's not a system, Mr. Pickett. That's a trap, and I won't walk into it. Pickett's friendliness evaporated like water off hot asphalt. "Suit yourself," he said, tossing his empty can into the truck bed. "But when those paddies come up short and the bank sends someone who isn't as nice as me, remember this conversation." He drove away. Linnea picked his can out of the truck bed, crushed it, and threw it in the recycling bin by the barn. She was alone again, and the loneliness was heavier than before, because Pickett, for all his slickness, had named the fear she carried every day. What if the bank did come? What if her father had been wrong? What if she was destroying the only thing he had left her? Let me tell you about Boyd Greer and what he saw in those drainage pools. Boyd was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had finished high school, barely, and gone straight to the rice like his father before him. But he had a quality that no university can teach and no degree can certify. He paid attention. Not the scattered, superficial attention of checking boxes, but the deep, patient attention of a man who believed that the world was trying to tell him some things, if he would only be still enough to hear it. In his later years, when the farm was struggling and the debt was mounting, he would take long walks along the drainage ditches at the far edges of the property. Linnea, as a teenager, sometimes walked with him. She remembered those walks with an ache that never quite faded. He would stop at a place where a shallow pool had formed behind a natural berm, a forgotten corner of the farm where no chemicals reached and no one went. "Look at this, Linny," he'd say, crouching at the water's edge. A pair of mallards would be paddling through the shallows, stirring the mud with their bills, leaving tiny clouds of sediment in their wake. Watch what happens behind them. She would look, and she would see it. Where the ducks had passed, the water was disturbed, aerated, alive with tiny bubbles. The mud they stirred released nutrients that had been locked in the anaerobic layer beneath. Within hours, a faint green bloom of algae would appear in their wake, the first link in a food chain that ended with clear water and dark, rich soil. "The spray kills everything," Boyd would say, almost to himself. "Then we have to replace everything with more chemicals." But here, nothing was killed. The ducks just move things around. They eat the weeds, they stir the mud, they leave their business behind, and the water does the rest. He would pick up a handful of the mud from the pool's edge. It was black, almost chocolate-colored, and it smelled sweet and earthy, like a forest floor after rain. Then he would walk to the nearest treated paddy and pick up a handful of that soil. It was gray, chalite with a faintly chemical smell that stung the nose. "Smell the difference, Linny?" She always could. He never took the leap. He was too deep in the cycle, too obligated to the bank, too exhausted by the annual gamble of planting and praying. But he wrote it all down, every sketch, every tentative hypothesis, and on that page in 1969, he had connected the dots with a question. He never had the courage it for him. Linnea was answering it for him. Now let me explain what was actually happening in those paddies. The quiet science behind the spectacle that everyone thought was madness. A rice paddy is a flooded ecosystem. When it is treated with herbicides, it becomes a dead zone, a shallow pool of water containing exactly one living thing, the rice plant. All the organisms that would normally inhabit such a system, the insects, the snails, the algae, the bacteria, the fungi, are killed or driven out. The soil beneath becomes compacted and anaerobic, a lifeless substrate that can only support plant growth through the constant addition of synthetic fertilizer. It is agriculture as life support, an expensive, fragile machine that breaks down the moment you stop feeding it chemicals. Linnea's ducks reversed this process. The Muscovies, hardy and voracious, ate the watergrass seedlings before they could compete with the rice. They ate the snails and the insects that would otherwise damage the young shoots. Their constant movement through the shallow water stirred the surface, breaking up the stagnant layer and allowing oxygen to penetrate. This oxygenation was critical. It awakened the aerobic bacteria in the soil, microbes that had been dormant for years under the chemical regime, and these bacteria began to do what they had always done: break down organic matter into plant-available nutrients. The duck droppings provided the raw material, rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The waste dissolved directly into the paddy water, creating a constant, gentle feed that reached the rice roots without the shock of a synthetic application. It was, in essence, a slow-release organic fertilizer delivered by a living, self-replicating systems that also controlled weeds and pests. And there was one more thing, something Linnea hadn't. The ducks' paddling feet, pushing through the mud, were performing a function that no tractor could replicate at that scale. They were aerating the root zone of the rice plants, loosening the compacted soil, allowing the roots to spread deeper and access water and nutrients that had been locked away. The rice in Linnea's paddies, she noticed by midsummer, was not just surviving. It was developing root systems twice as deep as anything she had seen on the farm. The first full season was a lesson in endurance. The work was relentless. She woke before dawn to move the ducks from one paddy to another, herding them along the levees with a long bamboo pole, learning their habits, their stubbornness, their surprising intelligence. She built simple shelters at the end of each paddy where they could roost at night, safe from foxes and raccoons. She learned to read their behavior the way her father had learned to read the soil. When they clustered at one end of a paddy, she knew the watergrass was thickest there. When they became listless, she knew the water level needed adjusting. They became, in a strange and genuine way, her partners. She lost weight that summer. She ate what she grew in the garden behind the farmhouse: tomatoes, okra, snap beans. She mended her own clothes. The phone rarely rang. When she drove into town for supplies, she could feel the looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached the counter. She was the duck lady, the girl who had lost her mind. There was a night in late July, a suffocating Arkansas night when the air was so thick you could wring water from it, when she almost broke. She was sitting on the farmhouse porch, her body aching from a 12-hour day, and she could hear the distant hum of Mr. Rawlins' crop duster making a late pass over his paddies. The smell of propanil drifted across the property line, sharp and acrid, and she watched his plane's lights moving against the dark sky like a mechanical firefly. His paddies would be clean tomorrow, the weeds dead, the cycle continuing. She went inside and opened the composition book to the page with her father's drawing. A simple sketch of a pond, ducks floating on the surface, arrows showing the flow of nutrients from water to soil to plant and back again. Below the sketch, in his careful hand, What if the ducks are the spray? She pressed her palm flat against the page, as if she could reach through the paper and touch his hand. She was not doing this for rice. She was not doing this for money. She was keeping a promise to a man who had seen the truth, but never had the strength to act on it. She closed the book. The doubt was still there, but it was smaller now, and the resolve that surrounded it was harder, denser, like a stone worn smooth by running water. The first harvest came in September. She hired a small crew from town, men who took the work because work was work, even if the woman paying them was considered eccentric. They brought the old combine through the East Paddies first, the ones where the ducks had spent the most time, and the rice that poured into the grain cart was different. Everyone could see it. The kernels were plumper, heavier, with a warm golden color that the chemical-fed rice across the fence line didn't have. When the yield numbers came back from the mill, Linnea sat in her truck in the parking lot and stared at the receipt for a long time. Her yield was average, not exceptional, not remarkable, just average, 7,000 pounds per acre, right at the county line. But her expenses were a fraction of everyone else's. No herbicide, no synthetic fertilizer, no crop duster fees. Repriests had eaten for steadily in the Paddies, their population growing in a way that was self-regulating and cost her nothing. When she subtracted her costs from her revenue, she had made a profit. A small one, but genuine. It was the first time the farm had been in the black in 7 years. She took a soil sample from the East Paddy and mailed it to the agricultural lab at the university in Fayetteville. She used a post office box for the return address, not wanting her name attached. When the results arrived 3 weeks later, she opened the envelope standing by the mailbox, her hands not quite steady. The organic matter, which had been measured at 0.8% in her father's last soil test, was now at 1.6%. The microbial biomass was, according to the lab, anomalously high for rice paddy soil in this region. The available nitrogen was moderate but stable, and the report noted the unusual presence of beneficial mycorrhizal fungi, organisms that had been absent from the county's chemically treated soils for decades. The land was waking up. Her father had been right. She held the paper against her chest and cried standing up right there by the road where anyone driving past could have seen her. And she did not care. The second year, the ducks had doubled in number. She sold the surplus drakes to Jessup at a small profit, another income stream her father's model hadn't predicted. She also sold duck eggs at the farmer's market in Stuttgart, where a small but growing audience of health-conscious buyers paid a premium for them. The rice yield climbed to 7,400 pounds per acre, above the county average, and the soil organic matter continued its slow, steady rise. The third year was the year the weather broke the pattern. A drought settled over Arkansas in June and didn't lift until September. The wells that supplied the pumping stations for the conventional rice farms began to strain. Water restrictions were imposed. Farmers who had been pumping thousands of gallons per acre to maintain the precise flood levels their chemical systems required found themselves rationing, and their yields collapsed. The chemically sterilized soil could not hold moisture. It was like pouring water on a parking lot. But Linnea's paddies were different. The revitalized soil, rich with organic matter and threaded through with fungal networks, held water the way a sponge holds it. She could flood with less, and the water stayed. Her ducks, adapted now to the farm's rhythms, worked the paddies with an efficiency that 3 seasons of breeding had honed. She lost some yield to the drought. Everyone did, but her loss was 10% where her neighbors was 40%. That fall, the numbers at the mill told a story that no one could ignore. Linnea Greer, 8,100 pounds per acre, county average, 5,200. She had outperformed the best chemical operations in the county by more than 50% in a drought year with no purchased inputs. The whispers at the co-op changed register. The laughter was gone. In its place was a silence that carried the weight of men reevaluating certainties they had held for their entire professional lives. How was she doing it? What had Boyd Greer known that the rest of them had missed? It was 2 years after the drought, 5 years after she had first released ducks into her paddies, that Mr. Pickett's company truck appeared on her road again. He had changed. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked on him like humility worn for the first time, an ill-fitting garment. The chemical company was in trouble. The drought had exposed the fragility of the system they sold, and farmers, drowning in debt, were beginning to ask questions they had never asked before. He found her in the equipment shed, rebuilding the carburetor on the old International Harvester. She had grease on her forearms and a socket wrench in her hand, and she looked up at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting this visit for a long time. "Miss Greer," he said. He was holding his cap in his hands, turning it slowly, the way men do when they are about to say something that costs them. She waited. She had learned that silence was a language of its own. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I came here 5 years ago, and I talked to you like you were a child who didn't know what she was doing. I offered you chemicals on credit like I was doing you a favor, when what I was really doing was trying to hook you into the same cycle that's broken half the farms in this county." "I know," she said. "Your yields," he continued, the words coming harder now. "They're the best in the region, and you've spent almost nothing. My company, we've been running the numbers. What you've built here, this system with the ducks in the rotation, it's more effective than anything we sell." "How did you know?" Linnea set the wrench down and wiped her hands on a rag. She looked past him through the open shed door to the paddies beyond, where the ducks were making their slow ancient circuit through the afternoon water, their wakes crisscrossing in patterns that looked, from a distance, like script. "I didn't know," she said. "My father saw it. He watched wild ducks in the drainage pools for years. He saw that wherever they went, the water was cleaner and the soil was richer. He just never had the chance to test it." "Miss Greer," Pickett said, and now his voice had the rehearsed quality of pitch, though it was shakier than the one he had delivered 5 years ago. "My company wants to pivot. Biological solutions. We could partner with you. Sell starter flocks, consulting packages, the whole program. We're talking national distribution. You'd be the face of it. The money would be significant." Linnea smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who has arrived at a destination after a very long walk and finds it exactly as they imagined. "Mr. Pickett," she said, "do you know why it works?" He shook his head. "Because nobody owns it. The ducks aren't a product. The bacteria in the soil aren't a formula. The cycle of nutrients through the water isn't something you can put in a bag. The moment you try to turn it into a business, you'll standardize it, and the moment you standardize it, you'll kill the very thing that makes it work. Every farm is different. Every piece of land has its own rhythms. My father understood that. The answer isn't a product. It's a relationship between the farmer and the land, and you can't sell a relationship." Pickett stood there for a moment, a man who had come looking for a commodity and found instead a truth that he had no container for. He nodded, put his cap on, and left. His truck disappeared down the gravel road, and Linnea turned back to the carburetor. There was still work to do before dark. The years that followed proved the strength of her father's vision in ways that even Linnea could not have predicted. In the early 1980s, when interest rates climbed and the price of rice fell, and the chemical treadmill demanded ever greater investments, for diminishing returns. The farms around her began to fail. Mr. Rollins was the first. He came to her door on a November evening, his big frame diminished, his face carrying the particular shame of a man asking for help from someone he had once pitied. "Linnea," he said, and he could not meet her eyes. "The bank's taking the farm, 320 acres. I've got 60 days. "I know," she said. She had been watching the notices in the county paper. "I was wondering if you might want to buy it. Before some corporation does, she bought it at a fair price, the price a neighbor should pay." And she shook his hand on the porch while the sun went down behind the levees. As he walked to his truck for the last time, he stopped and turned around. "Your daddy would be proud, Linnea," he said. His voice was not steady. She took his dead, gray soil and she brought it back to life. She extended her paddy system, released a new generation of ducks, descendants of those first 200, and began the slow, patient process of feeding the earth back to health. Over the next 2 decades, she did the same with 3 more neighboring farms, purchasing each one not as an investment but as a rescue. Her operation grew from 600 acres to nearly 3,000, surrounded by a landscape of chemical dependence and economic struggle. She became known in the region as the Duck Lady, and then the name, once a joke, became a title of quiet respect. Researchers from the University in Fayetteville came to study her paddies. They published papers with titles full of jargon about integrated avian aquatic nutrient cycling and biological weed suppression in flooded cereal systems. And Linnea read them with amusement because her father had described the same processes in a composition book with a sketch of a pond and a 1-sentence question. She also began selling the rice directly under a label she designed herself, Boyd's Gold. It was marketed as naturally grown, duck-tended rice, and it sold at 3 times the commodity price to restaurants and specialty grocers who valued the story as much as the grain. The duck eggs, the surplus birds, the rich compost she scraped from the paddy edges each winter, all of it became part of a diversified operation that generated multiple income streams from a single living system. If you were to visit that farm today, you would find a woman in her late 70s, her hair white as egret feathers, her hands still strong enough to grip a levee gate. She walks the paddies every morning, just as her father walked the ditches, but her pace is slower now, and she is rarely alone. Her niece's son, a boy of 19 with her same quiet, watching eyes, walks beside her. She does not lecture him, she shows him. She has him scoop a handful of the paddy soil, black and rich and alive with worms, and she has him smell it. She has him sit still at the levee's edge and watch the ducks work, and she asks him what he sees. In the farmhouse, on the desk in the room that was once her father's, the composition books sit in a neat stack. Beside them is a taller stack, Linnea's own notebooks, 30 years of observation, written in a hand that grew steadier with each passing season. One day she will give them all to the boy, and with them, the understanding that the land is not a machine to be driven, but a living thing to be listened to. The story of Linnea Greer is, at its heart, the simplest story there is. The men with the chemicals and the clipboards looked at a rice paddy and saw a factory floor, a problem of inputs and outputs, a system to be controlled with force. They told her to buy the answer. They told her to go into debt for it. They told her the land was a ledger and the only column that mattered was yield. Linnea, guided by the notebooks of a man who had spent his life watching water and mud and wild birds, looked at the same paddy and saw something else entirely. She saw a web of living connections, a system that had been feeding itself for 10,000 years before anyone thought to spray it with poison. She understood that the solution was not a product to be purchased, but a balance to be restored. They all laughed at her foolish ducks. but they never understood the real lesson. The ducks were just the beginning. The real harvest was in the patience, in the watching, and in the quiet, unbreakable conviction that if you stop fighting the land and start feeding it, the land remembers what it was always meant to do, and it feeds you back.